When you think about an election, what comes to mind? Probably massive rallies, those campaign ads you see everywhere, maybe even the long lines on voting day, right? But what if I told you that some of the biggest, most game-changing battles don't happen on the campaign trail at all? Nope, they happen inside a courtroom. Today, we're going to dive right into that fascinating space where law and democracy collide, a place where a judge's gavel can be every bit as powerful as your vote. So think about it. When an election gets messy, when candidates are challenged, votes are disputed, and the rules themselves are up for debate, who actually gets the final say? It's a huge question, and the answer, way more often than you'd think, is a judge. This is exactly where the Supreme Court steps onto the field as the ultimate arbiter. All right, so here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with the court's role as the head referee. Then we'll look at the fight candidate's face just to get their name on the ballot. After that, we'll get into the drama of disqualification cases. Then we'll see how a court ruling can literally change the vote count. And finally, we'll wrap it all up by talking about why any of this matters to you and me. Okay, let's start with the basics. You've got the Commission on Elections, right? COMELEC. They're the ones running the entire show. But they're not perfect. And that's where the Supreme Court comes in. Kind of like the final safety net. They're the last line of defense when a decision is so wrong it could mess up the whole democratic process. But they can't just jump in whenever they feel like it. No, the bar for them to get involved is incredibly high. The legal key they need is something called grave abuse of discretion. Now, the words here are really important. We're not talking about a simple oops or a minor error. Think of it like this. If a basketball referee makes a bad foul call, that's just a mistake. But what if the referee suddenly decides that from now on, baskets from one team are worth 5 points? Well, now they've just thrown the rulebook out the window. That is grave abuse of discretion. It's an action so out there, so wrong, it's as if they had no authority to make that call in the first place. And that's what gives the Supreme Court the power to step in. So let's talk about the very first hurdle for anyone who wants to run for office. Just proving you're a serious contender. Every election, tons of people file to run, but a whole lot of them never actually make it to the printed ballot. This is where we run into the whole idea of a nuisance candidate. The law basically gives COMELEC the power to filter out candidates who don't have a bona fide intention to run. This is supposed to protect the election from people who are just trying to make a joke of it, or more strategically, trying to confuse voters because they have a name similar to a major candidate. But, defining bona fide intention is where things get really, really tricky, and it has sparked some huge legal battles. So let's look at a perfect example. This is Wilson Ahmad. He's a media broadcaster from Mindanao, and in 2022, he decided to run for vice president. Well, COMELEC immediately moved to label him a nuisance candidate, and believe it or not, his case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So here's the showdown. On one side, you had COMELEC arguing that Ahmad wasn't known nationwide, he didn't have a big political party backing him up, and so he couldn't possibly run a serious campaign. But the Supreme Court, they saw it completely differently. They basically said, hold on a second. Being famous or having a big party machine, none of that is in the Constitution as a requirement to run. And because of that, they ruled that what COMELEC did was, you guessed it, a grave abuse of discretion. And this case really gets to the heart of a huge principle. The Supreme Court has said it time and time again in other cases. Your right to run for office can't just be for the wealthy or the famous. It's about your genuine intention, not how much money you have in the bank or how many people recognize your face. All right, so the courts can help someone get on the ballot. But what happens if a candidate is already there and then, boom, a legal skeleton from their closet threatens to get them kicked out? This leads us into the high-stakes drama of disqualification cases. I mean, you can't talk about this without bringing up the 2022 election. One of the biggest legal battles was the effort to disqualify Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. from the presidential race. And the entire thing hinged on a conviction from decades ago for not filing his income tax returns. To really get this, you have to look at the timeline. It all starts way back in 1995. The Court of Appeals convicts him. Now, here's the critical part. The law at the time said this kind of offense came with a penalty of being perpetually disqualified from public office. But the court's final written decision, well, it never actually mentioned that penalty. So fast forward to 2021. He files to run for president, and petitioners cry foul. They argue he lied on his application because that disqualification penalty should have been automatic. And the whole case, all of it, came down to this really powerful legal idea, the immutability of judgments. It sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple. It just means that once a court's decision is final, all appeals done, case closed, that's it. It's set in stone. You can't change it. Not even the Supreme Court can go back and edit it, even if they find a mistake. So here's the wild conclusion. The Supreme Court, in its own ruling, basically said, yeah, the 1995 court made an egregious mistake. They admitted it. They said that disqualification penalties should have been in there, but because of that immutability rule, their hands were tied. That 1995 judgment was final, so it was unchangeable. They couldn't build a time machine and fix the error. And because of that, his candidacy was allowed to proceed. A totally fascinating outcome that sparked a massive debate. Okay, we've seen courts decide who can even be on the ballot, but what about actually changing the results after we've all gone home from the polling stations? This is probably the most direct way you can see a gavel basically overrule the ballot box. For this, let's go to the absolutely wild 2022 governor's race in Negros Oriental. The votes were counted, a winner was proclaimed, and you'd think that was the end of it. But oh no. The final outcome wasn't decided on election night. It was decided in a courtroom months later. So how on earth did this happen? Well, it all started when a guy named Grego Degamo ran for governor, clearly trying to confuse voters who were looking for the main candidate, Roel Degamo. After the election, Comelec officially declared this Grego guy a nuisance candidate. Now, the law here is super clear. Any votes for someone declared a nuisance are basically thrown out. They're considered stray. So that's exactly what happened. Comelec annulled thousands of votes, retallied the remaining valid ones, and what do you know? The final result completely flipped. Roel Degamo was proclaimed the actual winner. So, we've walked through all these incredible cases, nuisance candidates, disqualifications, even post-election results being overturned. So, what's the bottom line? Why should you, the average voter, care about all these complicated legal fights? Let's boil it all down. First, the courts are there to protect the right of any citizen to run for office, not just the rich and powerful. That's a big deal. Second, they act as a gatekeeper, helping keep our ballots clean from people who are just there to cause confusion. Third, we've learned that legal finality is a huge deal. Old decisions stick, even when they're flawed. And finally, and this might be the most important one, at the end of the day, a single court ruling can be just as powerful as millions of votes, with the power to completely change who governs us. And all of this leaves us with one last, really big question to chew on. We depend on our courts to be a fair referee, to enforce the rules of the game. But as we've seen, sometimes the rules themselves can lead to these really surprising, even controversial results. So that makes you wonder, if the court is the referee, who is responsible for writing and, when necessary, rewriting the actual rulebook for a democracy?